So good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules this morning to join us for a talk on the Sino-Russian Partnership, and I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Bobo to be with us here today. As a little bit of background on this topic, I had the pleasure of hearing today's speaker several years ago at the annual Deterrence Workshop, which CGSR co-sponsors at Wilton Park in the United Kingdom. And Mr. Lowe was very thoughtful and very articulate in his remarks on Russia and his remarks on China, which is really saying something because the Wilton Park events are always really top shelf workshops with a lot of very smart people at the table. And his comments stood out, and his comments inspired me to go out and buy both of the books he'd written on the subject. One was 2008's Axis of Convenience, Moscow, Beijing, and New Geopolitics, which the Washoe County Library obviously did not get enough use out of, but I purchased from them, and have enjoyed reading that. And then his other book is 2015's Russia in the New World Disorder, which was also really good and very timely given the events in Ukraine. And I remember at the time, as I was reading Axis of Convenience 5 or 6 years ago, people, were not placing a whole lot of stock in this idea that this was a real concern, right? And they certainly weren't thinking about this partnership in 2008 when the book was written. And Mr. Lowe, I think, was one of the first that really sort of seized on this idea as being particularly interesting. At the time, you'd see some boilerplate on the strategic partnership after a summit meeting or a meeting between the Russian National Security Council leadership and their Chinese counterparts. You'd see some token participation maybe in a Shanghai Cooperation Organization military exercise. There'd be some really new looking Chinese equipment or fresh looking Chinese military uniforms standing next to some really beat up looking Russian equipment with Russian soldiers in dirty fatigues at somewhere in Central Asia. And people would sniff and they'd say, nothing to worry about, right? This is all for show. The arguments would be that there were these friction points in relationship, right? That there was the Arctic, there was Central Asia and power dynamics, that the Russians were wary of Chinese reverse engineering of their system and they wouldn't sell modern equipment to the Chinese, that this was only a relationship based on energy supply and demand. And the big one, of course, that everybody mentioned was that there was this well-known but never openly stated fear that Russia was really, really worried about China in the Far East, which would always be related, is completely grounded in fact, even though if you sort of pulled the thread on it, on further investigation, it would be something that somebody had heard, 4 times removed from the source, whispered at some track 2 event and over coffee in Moscow or something. But this worry that Russia was deeply, deeply afraid of China in the Far East because of economic disparities, demographic disparities, and that would always impact the partnership. But you fast forward to today, right? A very different dynamic in the discussion, right? The sniffing sort of dismissiveness is largely gone. And the question is now not whether something exists, but what do you call it? Do you call it a strategic partnership? Do you call it alliance? Do you call it something else, and so on? And how deep does it go, right? And then what does it all mean for U.S. defense planning, for multipolar geopolitics? So Brad and I both remembered Mr. Lowe's book. We remembered all of his fantastic insights at Wilton Park, and we decided that with a question of this magnitude and given how topical the subject was, we'd bring in the really big intellectual guns here to tackle this because it's on so many people's minds at the moment in the policy community about the Sino-Russian partnership and its implications for the global order. So a little bit about the author. Bobo, he's an independent international relations analyst. He's an associate research fellow with the Russian NIST Center at the French Institute for International Relations, IFRI, in Paris. He's a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia. He's a non-resident senior fellow with the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was head of the Russia-Eurasia program at Chatham House, and he was also deputy head of mission at the Australian Embassy in Moscow. The ground rules of the discussion for those who don't often turn into these events, Mr. Lowe is going to talk for about 30 to 45 minutes on the record. We'll post a video recording of this up on the CGSR website in a couple of weeks. We'll follow the remarks with about 45 minutes of moderated Q&A, which will be off the record. If you'd like to join the conversation, please submit questions in the chat. Please raise your hands electronically as early as you can, as early as you come up with those questions or remarks so we can get the discussion rolling when Mr. Lowe is done with his remarks. So Bobo, thank you again so much for taking the time to be with us. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and over to you, Bobo, for your remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. It's a great pleasure and great honor for me to speak to the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. I certainly remember our discussions at Wilton Park, hugely stimulating for me. So I look forward to sharing some thoughts today, and I hope and really look forward to your questions and interventions. So look, I'm going to divide the talk in 5 bits, if you like, 5 parts. So initially, I'm going to talk about what are the drivers and trends in the Sino-Russian partnership. I'm then going to talk about how China and Russia and the relationship fits in terms of sort of international order. In the third part, I'll talk about the near-term outlook. So basically where I think the relationship is going over the next 5 to 10 years. Fourth part, I'll talk about longer-term trends that we should keep an eye out. And then finally, I want to talk about what the implications are for Western policy making. So let me start off with the drivers and trends of the Sino-Russian partnership. I think the first thing to say is that it is strong, multifaceted and resilient. And really, relations are better than at any time in the two countries' history. You know, we're accustomed to hearing about how relations are fantastic, but you know the actuality is less than the propaganda. But here, it actually there is a kind of you know the achievements on the ground match up to at least quite a lot of the rhetoric emanating out of Beijing and Moscow. However, contrary to what you may have heard, this is no alliance. What this is a classic great power relationship, meaning it's driven by common interests rather than shared values. And contrary to popular supposition, hostility towards Washington is not the primary motivation for Sino-Russian cooperation. What the partnership really is, it's an example of, we think in terms of sort of the animal kingdom, it's a prime example of mutualism. It brings critical dividends to both sides. What are these dividends? Political comfort, an enhanced sense of security, military and technological expertise, geopolitical benefits, and economic gains. So let me just dive down a little bit here and talk about the first rationale for partnership, which is political comfort. Essentially, by supporting each other, Beijing and Moscow aim to reinforce the legitimacy and stability of their respective regimes. You know, each really is the nearest thing the other has to a friend. Another major dividend from their partnership is security, enhanced security, confidence building. Now, this is not only intrinsically valuable, but also because it enables Beijing and Moscow to focus on other priorities. And the consolidation of their shared strategic rear is especially important in this regard. Now, defense cooperation is one of the more successful areas of the partnership, and really it's brought dividends again to both sides. Moscow has used defense cooperation to project Russian influence and to enhance its status within the bilateral relationship, while the People's Liberation Army has gained access to advanced military technology and invaluable operational experience. Now, Chinese expertise has been key to filling the technological gap left by the withdrawal of Western companies in Russia after sanctions were imposed following the annexation of Crimea. And Chinese investment in technology has been absolutely critical to the realization of Russia's Arctic LNG projects. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about strategic and geopolitical calculus, and it's fair to say that it plays a central role in the Sino-Russian relationship, albeit in rather different ways. China doesn't need Russia so much as an active ally. What it needs, really, is an acquiescent partner which will not obstruct Chinese goals. In other words, it needs it not to be a pain in the ass. Now, this is exemplified by the accommodation over Xi Jinping's flagship venture, the Belt and Road Initiative, but also it is key to China's ability to, say, penetrate in the Arctic through the so-called Polar Silk Road, because without Russian say-so, China has zero prospects in the Arctic. Now, for Moscow, the Sino-Russian Partnership works in slightly different ways. It's a force multiplier. Close association with Beijing gives Moscow and gives Russia an international weight that is far above what it would be able to achieve just by itself. In other words, it's key to Russia's capacity and confidence to assert itself as a global player. Now, in recent years, economic ties have grown significantly. This used to be the weakest part of the relationship, but I think that assumption is no longer true. It is certainly not as true as it used to be. China is Russia's #1 country trading partner today, while Russia is the second largest source of Chinese oil imports after Saudi Arabia. And as I mentioned before, China is also a primary source of investment for major energy projects such as Arctic LNG up in the Yamal Peninsula. Now, Moscow sees China as Russia's principal economic partner in the long term. It's quite interesting. The Russian 2035 energy strategy is predicated on a substantial expansion of Chinese demand for Russian LNG and pipeline gas. And meanwhile, Chinese manufacturing exports are penetrating the Russian consumer market, and cyber and telecoms cooperation is expanding rapidly. So if we were to sum up the bilateral relationship, we'd say, well, yes, the Sino-Russian partnership is increasingly asymmetrical. And yes, their views of global order differ in some respects. But what really counts is that both sides continue to see engagement as mutually beneficial. And this gives their partnership real strength, real resilience. And moreover, while it's certainly true that Russia is becoming economically more dependent on China, this, I think, is counterbalanced by the fact that Beijing increasingly needs Russia's political and geopolitical support. So this leads naturally to the second part of my tour, which is China, Russia, and the world. Now, it's true that China and Russia agree on many key principles. They agree that a dominant United States is an undesirable development. They believe in the primacy of great powers in global politics. And they also believe in the central importance of state sovereignty. And besides the sort of that general convergence on large principles, they also agree on many individual issues, whether it's a sovereign internet, Iran, North Korea, and of course, opposition to missile defense. However, they are strategically autonomous actors with different attitudes and approaches to international order. So what is the difference? The difference is this: Beijing is a system player. It operates on the premise that the existing, somewhat anarchic international order continues to favor Chinese interests in the main. It therefore seeks to game the system from within, exploiting both its advantages, but also its shortcomings. Now, by contrast, Moscow is what I'd call a system disruptor. In the long term, of course, it hopes for a 21st century concert of great powers in which Russia plays the role of balancer between the United States and China, basically the holder of the strategic equilibrium. But in the meantime, Russia really operates a kind of almost a guerrilla warfare foreign policy. It looks to exploit opportunities arising from a fluid and unstable international environment. Now, the fact that China is a system player while Russia is a system disruptor surprisingly, has not soured their relationship. Because what both sides have managed to do is reconcile their agendas, and they've also both been very careful to avoid actions that might upset the other. Nevertheless, the differences between them are significant enough to ensure that they do not operate as a coordinated force in international politics, let alone working together to build a new world order, as they are sometimes accused of doing. There is no grand conspiracy against the West, and each side has surprisingly little influence on the other's decision-making. So, for example, in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, Beijing acts on its own initiative. And in Europe and, say, the Middle East, Moscow pursues an independent agenda. For each side, for each country, foreign policy is a wholly sovereign affair. Now, fears that Russia has become increasingly subservient to China are misplaced. Putin remains committed to positioning Russia as an independent center of global power, beholden neither to the West nor to China. So that means, in addition to diversifying ties across Asia, he's also looking to maintain close economic ties with Europe and some level of stable interaction with the United States, and also to reinforce Russia's political and security presence in the post-Soviet space. Now, in the meantime, Beijing continues to handle Moscow with care. It's aware of Russia's considerable disruptive capacity, and it's also aware of China's own vulnerabilities. Now, suggestions that Moscow would be willing, in the event of US-China confrontation, to intervene in support of Beijing, I think those suggestions are thoroughly implausible, because such a course would risk major collateral damage to Russia's interests and undermine the strategic independence that it values so much. Now, Beijing also understands that Russian support for Chinese aims is likely to be partial and conditional. Now, there's been quite a lot of speculation about, who was behind or how much support did they get for recent actions in South China Sea in relation to Taiwan, on Ukraine, and so on. Well, let me just take each of these. Contrary to some claims, there is no evidence that the Russian military buildup next to Ukraine was coordinated with China. Putin's actions were motivated by a specifically Russian agenda. They were not done to run interference for Beijing's activities around Taiwan. And equally, it is improbable that China would allow itself to be implicated in a confrontation in Europe. Now, I think that Sino-Russian defense cooperation is, surprisingly perhaps, a marginal factor in Beijing's aggressive behavior in the Western Pacific and more generally its assertive globalism. But here's the paradox. Western alarmism on this, Western suspicions on this score have had the unintended consequence of maximizing Chinese and especially Russian leverage. Now, we think, well, the problem with global order, what is the essential problem? Well, clearly, China and Russia have behaved badly in many respects. But I think to a large extent, they've also become scapegoats for the crisis of global order. Because while many of their actions are certainly egregious, I believe that the crisis of liberalism and the liberal world order has been largely self-inflicted. Beijing and Moscow have exploited, if you like, the suicidal statecraft of the West, but they did not cause it. So over the past 2 decades, I think Western governments have failed on 3 major counts. They failed to live up to the values underpinning a liberal order. So under George W. Bush, and especially under Donald Trump, we saw an American exceptionalism with very few constraints. And the problem with that, other than its ethical problems, is that it's invited Beijing and Moscow to act as they please, to act with impunity. That's one problem. Second problem is disastrous policymaking, Western policymaking, whether it's in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, the global financial crisis, the handling of the coronavirus response. The problem here is that Western mistakes, Western ineptitude has empowered China and Russia. Across the world, the West has never appeared so ineffectual. It's no longer, for many countries, a model to emulate. And then the third problem is that the West has become thoroughly divided within itself. Under Donald Trump, transatlantic relations sunk to their lowest point since the Suez crisis, while Europe was riven by widening divisions. Now, I think Joe Biden has attempted strenuously to restore the transatlantic consensus, but unfortunately, I think with very mixed results. I think the relative success of his European tour has been undermined by the fiasco of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and most recently, of course, the mishandling of the Australia-UK-US deal. So let me go to the third part, which is the near-term outlook. I think the Sino-Russian partnership will be pretty stable in the short to medium term. And this is sort of flagged by the 5-year extension to the 2001 Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation. I think both sides will continue to value engagement, especially against the backdrop of a volatile international context, and neither is going to want to risk a deterioration in the relationship. Basically, the relationship is too important to be allowed to fail. Now, I think the current format of a strategic partnership, strong yet flexible, also will continue to suit both sides because it allows them to engage productively with other players without prejudice to the partnership itself. Beijing and Moscow will continue to develop other relationships, both for their own sake, but also to enhance strategic flexibility. Now, I mentioned earlier that the relationship is becoming is asymmetrical. I think it will become increasingly so. But here's the rub. Russia is still and will remain a formidable, preventative, and disruptive power. And so it will retain its geopolitical independence. I also think that strategic coordination between Beijing and Moscow will remain limited. As before, as today, they will align and cooperate when it serves their respective interests. But otherwise, they're just going to do their own thing. But we can, I think, expect some strengthening of bilateral defense cooperation. More frequent joint air patrols, larger PLA contingents in Russian-led exercises, maybe enhanced military-to-military dialogue and exchanges, and I think expansion of China's missile early warning system. America will remain the principal adversary for both Beijing and Moscow. But I think there is no evidence yet that they are readying themselves for a two-front confrontation, or indeed even to run interference for each other, whether it's in the Asia Pacific or Eastern Europe. Because the problem here is that the risks of such interventions and such games playing vastly exceed the potential benefits. I think they'll only be considered if we find ourselves in a situation where the United States is waging war on China and Russia simultaneously. So looking at the long-term prospects now, part 4. I think, well, obviously, the long-term outlook is less clear. And here there are several potential variables I want to draw your attention to. The first is what I call the globalism of Chinese foreign policy. We're going to see an ever more globalist, that is ambitious and capable China. And what this might mean for the relationship is this. Over time, Beijing could become less inclined to treat Moscow as an equal partner. There might not be a specific provocation, like, I personally don't think that they're going to try and redraw the Sino-Russian border in the Russian Far East. But what I think we could see is a pattern of increasingly disrespectful, impolite, behavior as the Chinese leadership decides that the partnership is no longer so essential to its objectives. Now, the problem for Beijing is that even if it does continue to be polite and show respect and, tip its sort of cap, even if it massages Russian sensitivities, I think the Kremlin may, in any case, become increasingly allergic to the widening gap between the two countries' capabilities and the reality of a relationship conducted largely on Beijing's terms. This, I think, could lead to cautious attempts on Moscow's part to normalize relations with the West. But I think Moscow will be careful not to burn its bridges with Beijing. So it's really going to try and keep all the balls in the air, so to speak. The second key variable is, of course, US-China rivalry. Now, in the event of military confrontation between the United States and China, now clearly both Washington and Beijing would exert strenuous efforts to court Moscow, or to make sure that it plays a role that conforms to their respective objectives. Now, you might think that this would strengthen Moscow's hand, but actually I think Russia would face some pretty uncomfortable choices. Moscow would want to reserve its options, naturally, but this could become very difficult given the intensity of confrontation between Washington and Beijing. For example, Beijing, I think the Chinese are likely to become more demanding over time, and I think the United States could well revert to a kind of Bushian thing of you're either for us or against us. Third key variable, and this might be of particular interest to you given all your research, is strategic nuclear weapons. Now, Moscow has reacted pretty calmly to the recent expansion in Chinese strategic nuclear capabilities, and it's done this for several reasons. First, it's quite pleased that the expansion, the new silos have upset the Americans so much. There's a certain sort of schadenfreude here. Second, the gap in capabilities between the two nuclear superpowers and China remains vast, so the Russians are relatively relaxed about that. Third, there is no direct security as threat to Russia, at least they don't perceive one. And fourth, the Chinese buildup actually reduces the pressure on Russia to make any concessions itself. So, yeah, they're pretty relaxed about this Chinese expansion. However, in the hypothetical case that China were to transition to a first-ranked nuclear weapons power, this would lead naturally to a major rethinking of Russian strategic assumptions. For Moscow, nuclear weapon superiority over China represents not just the ultimate security guarantee, but also an equalizer in terms of the larger relationship between them. So even a more modest expansion of Chinese nuclear weapons capabilities would cement the view in Moscow that any future arms control regime must be multilateral. Another variable, the Arctic. I think there could be, in the longer term, we're not going to see this, I think, for, I would say, 5 to 10 years at least. But in the longer term, I think there are going to be heightened tensions in the Arctic, given the contradiction in Russian and Chinese views of the status of the region. Now, Moscow regards, as you know, much of the Arctic Ocean as Russian territorial waters, whereas Beijing sees the Arctic as part of the global commons. Now, these differences have been glossed over until now, but I think as the economic and geopolitical significance of the Arctic grows over the coming decades, these differences could become more overt and more difficult to manage. Then I want to mention climate change and energy ties. Now, the growing prominence of climate change and the global shift towards decarbonization will clearly impact Sino-Russian energy cooperation and the partnership in general. Because Xi Jinping's commitment that China will reach peak emissions by 2030, carbon neutrality by 2060, call into question one of the pillars of the economic relationship, the energy relationship. Regardless, and here's the thing, regardless of whether China actually achieves these targets, even just the attempt to meet them will have significant ramifications for Russian oil and gas exports to China. And China's development of wind and solar will strengthen its bargaining position with Russia in coming decades. So the big question here is this: how will Beijing and Moscow behave towards one another in circumstances where one of Russia's strongest comparative advantages is becoming nullified? And there's Eurasia. Now, of course, there's potential. People have been talking about the potential for tensions to grow in post-Soviet Central Asia for at least 2 decades. But until now, Beijing and Moscow have been quite successful in reconciling their different agendas. And they've done this through a de facto division of labor between Chinese economic and financial power on the one hand, and Russian security and geopolitical primacy on the other. But I think that this so-called division of labor, it's not really sustainable in the long run, because the expansion of Chinese economic influence in and of itself has geopolitical consequences. Ultimately, influence is influence, power is power. And we need to get away from thinking that you can have this neat compartmentalization between, say, economic influence on the one hand and security and geopolitics on the other. And then Mike mentioned the Russian Far East. Now, in theory, China could revive territorial ambitions in the Russian Far East. But I actually think that the risk-reward equation makes this unlikely. The Chinese side of the border is far more developed than the adjoining Russian regions. Few Chinese have shown much interest in residing in the Russian Far East, and Chinese companies already enjoy privileged access to the region's resources. So given the lack of obvious dividends, it's hard to imagine why Beijing would risk conflict with a nuclear superpower and for such low stakes. So finally, I want to get to the implications for Western policy. I think if we're going to be serious about addressing China and Russia and the Sino-Russian Partnership, we need to understand first that their relationship is a typical one between great powers. It's not about values, it's about interests, it's about realpolitik. Now, it's become fashionable lately to talk about, oh, maybe we can drive a wedge between Russia and China. If we accommodate Russia, they'll distance themselves from the Chinese. So this sort of kind of crude strategic triangularism. I find such ideas laughable. I think they're utterly delusional. There is no deal the West can offer Putin that would persuade him to loosen ties with Beijing. On the contrary, it just encourages him to play Western policymakers for suckers, and therefore it enhances Russian leverage. If we're going to be serious about countering China, then we have to outperform it. That's how the West won the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and that is our primary task in coming decades. I think Western policymakers need to focus on concrete priorities rather than indulge in vague abstractions and name calling, authoritarian governance model, rules-based international order, rallying the world's democracies, malign actors. We need to deal in specifics. And that means tackling basic failures of governance within the West, such as voter suppression in the United States. It means modernizing security, cyber, and technological capabilities. It means pushing back against specific Chinese acts of aggression in the Western Pacific, or Russia's cyber operations and delinquent behavior in Eastern Europe, and Moscow and Beijing's foreign influence and disinformation activities. In other words, it's time for us to stop whining and start acting. And in this connection, the West should be making much greater efforts to mitigate climate change and global poverty. And that means being much more generous to the developing world on issues like climate financing, vaccine access, infrastructural funding, overseas development assistance. Because we can talk about all these in principle, as, for example, was the case at the Cornwall G7 summit. But ultimately, talk is cheap. The rich liberal democracies of the West need to deliver. And finally, we need to work much more closely with allies and regional partners. But not just them. We need to also work with the unconverted. Because in the end, if there is to be a rules-based international order, then it cannot be seen to be one that's established by the West, largely for the benefit of the West. Thank you. I'll leave it at that.